We need to be careful that when we're being critical, thinking deeply, asking big questions, that it doesn't just come across as a pessimism, as sort of an empty negativity of a tearing systems down. So when we were talking about Foucault as an example, often students, even myself, will come away from Foucault thinking, wow, well, okay, now we understand things are bad, but what the heck do we do about it? Well, today I want to think about some of the constructive ways in which we might rethink democracy, consumer culture, and leadership in general. And when I want to do that in a way that looks at traditional Indigenous values. Specifically, Taiaiake Alfred, a prominent Indigenous scholar. I'm going to be looking at a 1999 text, Peace, Power, Righteousness, an Indigenous Manifesto. And I want to just brainstorm again some of these ways in which we might rethink democracy, consumer culture, and leadership. Let's start with a quote from Alfred. Challenging mainstream society to question its own structure, its acquisitive individualistic value systems, and the false premises of colonialism is essential if we are to move beyond the problems plaguing all of our societies, native and white, and rebuild relations between our peoples. A deep reading of tradition points to a moral universe in which all of humanity is accountable to the same standard. End quote. This is interesting for a number of reasons. First, I think he points out something that most of us would agree to, that is that society is deeply acquisitive, not inquisitive, acquisitive, wanting to get stuff, more and more stuff. Our economy is based on it, but it gets out of hand, obviously. Not just those of us who hoard things, but just the sheer vastness and the volume of the products we consume that are junk. Entire industries based on junk. Low quality. This is weird hyper consumerism that's a problem. The individual value systems, for many that's also a problem. It's not clear exactly what that means, individuality, and as we will see today as we're talking, we'll see that maybe the individuality is more lip service than anything else, given that while we allow individuals to have some measure of freedom, ultimately who's really in charge, who's really controlling are the laws and the government, which determine much of our individuality, but we'll get back to that. And the false premises of colonialism, which we've talked about at length. By looking at these things, we see what ails us, some of the deep issues of culture. What do we do then? Do we just keep pointing at them and being upset? He has made the decision to do what he calls a deep reading of tradition, look at the Indigenous values, and to ask, is there a moral universe, a moral code, a compass by which we might all live, to which we're all going to be held accountable in some way? Let's go through a list of values or ideas and see which ones resonate with you. We'll try and do a comparison and a contrast of traditional Western values, or what we have today, and more traditional Indigenous values. Start with individual freedom. Alfred argues that individual freedom is something prized in the Indigenous communities. That's a tricky thing. What is individual freedom? At heart, individual freedom in the West, at least, has often been argued to be something that is a protection. To be free means to be protected from the tyranny of the majority, popular opinion, people telling you what to think and do. It means being protected from government coming in and forcing you to act, to believe a certain thing or do a certain thing. It just means freedom not to be interfered with, to be left alone in certain ways. Individual freedom expresses itself in many ways. You can speak a certain thing, dress a certain way, believe what you want. Great. But what if that kind of way of thinking hasn't brought real true freedom about? And what if, as we've discussed with Foucault and many others, real freedom is being curtailed by a tyranny of democracy? That is, the system of democracy that we have right now imposes its will upon us through laws and government ideas or ideologies in a way that we might not feel like it's a tyranny, but in fact it very much is a tyranny. As we talk, keep that in mind. While we may say we prize individual freedom and we may feel like our community does encourage it, maybe it doesn't. That would be interesting if that's the case. The next point, community responsibility. We have a sense of individual responsibility We understand rights and responsibilities. When somebody as an individual does something wrong, we punish them. When someone does something wrong to the community, we punish that individual. But what, as a community, do we truly feel responsible for? Here's an example of how this individuality might be in conflict with a sense of community responsibility. If I go 3 doors this way or 4 doors that way, I cannot tell you the name of the people who live there. I have no idea. And in fact, I'm not even sure what they look like. Why? Because I have no idea what my immediate community is all about. Who they are, I don't know their belief systems, I don't know their background. I cannot in any real way be connected to them responsibly as a community to feel like we should do this, to clean up the garbage, to take care of the poor. There's no way, there's no connection there. That's troubling if that's the case, and quite a bit different, obviously, in a traditional Indigenous community where you relied upon one another for your very survival. You needed to know your neighbor to communicate with them. You need to know the people around you so that you could live. That doesn't seem to be the case. We have a sense of community in terms of federal government, municipal government, or provincial government, municipal government. We have this generalized sense. But to say that in this community, I operate and function in a responsible way in the world with people, that's just simply not the case. I operate and function in the world with people in a generalized sense. I pay taxes to an anonymous group of people that do anonymous things with my taxes, but there's no first-hand accountability or responsibility. That seems to be largely true. Another value is not to reduce the freedom of beings, other beings, not just human beings. So traditional Indigenous communities, you probably heard the stereotype, they're more mindful of environmental responsibilities, they're more mindful of creatures, they're more mindful of other beings. And this is where Alfred is going. We want to give freedom to individuals, but what happens maybe if we gave freedom to the same kind of freedom we give to humans to the earth, where it too had rights, it too had a right is just society has an obligation to defend something. So if I have a right, then society has an obligation to defend my right to privacy or my right to shelter or something like that. What happens if we extend that freedom to the rest of the world? The creatures, the rivers, the streams, to the physical reality around us. A lot of us are getting closer to thinking that way, and that's certainly been the sort of general trajectory of Western thought, but we're very much behind that curve. Traditionally, it's been who has freedom, who has rights? Only human beings, specifically white, typically rich human beings, or people in power, depending on where you are in the world. If not white, but just people in power, they had freedom, they had rights. Well, traditionally speaking, is it not better then to take that traditional Indigenous perspective in which rights are extended to others? I'm going to read from an Indigenous scholar, Daniel Quinn. Quote, "Indigenous people believe that man belongs to the world. Civilized people believe that the world belongs to man." End quote. So Indigenous peoples believe that we belong to the world, that is, that we have some sense of responsibility to it by nature. That's just the way it is. By contrast, the so-called civilized people believe that everything is ours, we can do what we want with it. And as we've discussed in other topics, it's not just the world, it's not just things, but people themselves become the possessions that those in power believe that they can control as well. Okay, so that's maybe another way in which we can begin to think some of the ways that we might redesign society or rethink society. Leadership and democracy. What might traditional Indigenous values tell us about leadership? Today, we have, in democracy at least, we tend to get this cult-like following that if you can get enough elections, if you get enough votes, and you win the election, then you become a very popular figure, you become a very powerful figure, depending on what kind of office you're running for. Like in the case of premier or president or something like that, there's a lot of power that comes with that. You will forever be famous. And that's an odd thing. We have these celebrities, in many cases, again, cult-like figures, that for some can do no wrong. Because they've been voted in, because we have this thing called a representative democracy, where the average person doesn't actually have a say in government. The average person gets together with another average person, and if they have enough votes, if they have a loud enough voice through those votes, then they vote for somebody else, and that somebody else gets to have the decision-making powers. Now, they're supposed to reflect the will of the people, the majority. Often, obviously, that's not the case, but that's the goal. The question we have before us is this sense of leadership and democracy, a representative government, somehow fundamentally broken? Well, consider this. For the Indigenous community, there's supposed to be, ideally, traditionally, no coercive or centralized authority. No centralized or coercive authority. Well, what would that might mean? Well, whatever that means is kind of a weird thing for the Western mindset, because we're accustomed to this idea of you vote for somebody, and then for the next number of years, whatever they say, you just have to tolerate it until you get another vote. So they can be as coercive and forceful as they want. Coercive can be all kinds of reward punishment scenarios, laws, taxation, actual physical force. It could be all of that could be possible. And this idea of a centralized authority is that there are fewer and fewer people with more and more power. So the higher up the pyramid you go until you get to the very top, there's this filtering mechanism where all of the decisions for society get filtered through this person or this group, and then this person, this group, until it goes right to the very top. And those people have, traditionally speaking, the largest amount of power, the greatest amount of say. That's how we run societies in the West. What if we got rid of that? What if we got rid of both the coercive side in terms of laws, punishments, and we also got rid of that centralized authority? What would it look like? It's so weird to even try to imagine running a culture without that centralized coercive authority. What it would look like in part, if you looked at Rousseau, if you've ever researched Rousseau, you get this. It becomes a direct democracy, where instead of having a representative that you vote for, direct democracy is people having a voice and having a say that is supposed to lead to some kind of consensual agreement. This is incredibly hard to imagine, both because we're just used to a different form of government, but it's also hard to imagine because the practicality of having everybody having a say, having a voice, and then agreeing on a topic seems astronomically difficult. But I mean, the practicality is harder, but remember, we're trying to reimagine now how we might rethink culture. What would happen in Canada if we have, instead of 36 million people, let's say we have 5,000. 5,000 here, 5,000 there, and we have this generalized nation called Canada. But every group of 5,000 is regionally run. So each group of 5,000 people has to have some sort of consensus government. I'm making up a number now, but in that 5,000, there's no premier, there's no prime minister, there's no ruler with the ultimate say. Each person has to have a voice. Now, not everybody of that 5,000 is going to agree. Let's say 4,995 agree. That is still incredibly powerful and so much better than what we currently have. As you know, some countries, their representative democracy doesn't even need half the population to actually have someone in power. The United States. Now that's deeply troubling because you don't even have half the population. But even if you had half the population, let's say you had 60% of the population, then you still have almost half, 40, whatever you have at least half that fundamentally disagrees with the decisions that are being made. That in and of itself is odd, that we would accept that kind of way of thinking. Not only does that marginalize people, it makes any sense of progress or moving forward, especially when you have checks and balances and different levels of government that might house these different ways of thinking. It just frustrates that idea of progress. Now, again, is it more viable? Is it more efficient? These are all important questions, but still, from an Indigenous perspective, from the Indigenous, traditional Indigenous perspective, having a coercive centralized government, not a good idea. And maybe it's something we need to rethink as well. Connected to that is this new idea of leadership, obviously, in which we don't have someone at the top, but in some real way, the community itself becomes a hub of its own leadership. We saw something like this with Hooks, in which she argued for a new form of feminism, in which we had people to inspire, but we didn't have rulers. We'd have leaders, but we didn't have people at the power, do this because I said so. It just is a rethinking of the system. So you're getting hints of this from different angles now, from the feminist perspective, the indigenous perspective, that just the very way that things are run doesn't seem to work in a top-down leadership model. The top-down leadership model fails us time and time again. Again, one of the obvious criticisms is, well, if we're going to change the system, it's going to require such a vast overhaul that maybe that too makes it impossible to change the system. So we'll just compromise and we'll stick with what we have. I'm not sure that that's the best answer, but that's often a criticism that's given, that change is simply too difficult at this stage. Along with this idea of change in leadership and a non-coercive centralized power comes a question of, well then, what makes people act? What makes people fall in line? When you have a society, you have to run that society. You have to have some way of distributing food and protections and all these different things. So what motivates people? The primacy, I can almost say it, of conscience. Alfred's argument is that in traditional indigenous communities, it wasn't the law that was primary. It wasn't some sense of obligation or duty to a military or to a social economic status, but it was a moral compass that is often in conflict. And it's a moral compass largely of the individual, of course, as an individual in a community. Recall we were talking about Hannah Arendt and this idea that totalitarianism is when people suspend their own conscience. Totalitarianism requires that people become obedient to the grand mechanism of society. Even though it may be committing atrocities, people just feel like they need to be a part of the system. Here we have that conflict. Indigenous values say, no, that's not how you should be behaving to some overlord that directly conflicts with your sense of moral obligation, of respect, equality, fairness, your belief in other beings having rights. Just if we stop there, that other beings have rights, and if that's a part of your conscience, then many of the laws that are being acted upon now around the world, people wouldn't do that anymore. They wouldn't be following them because they violate basic respect for different sexual orientations and all these different, they violate that basic respect for other people. So let's return to that primacy of conscience. Does that have problems? Absolutely, because not everybody's going to agree. But at least that's a better direction in many ways than abstract laws that might not reflect the true needs of a people. One way to think about the power of this centralized, coercive kind of state or government or the rules or laws, in my immediate context, my wife and I have a small bit of property, about 12 acres, and before we bought the property, it was made clear to us by the municipality that there were a number of parts of the property that had to be protected as green space. EH1 is the technical designation. It's a high environmental impact. There's some rivers and some streams that they absolutely want protected no matter what. And yet, we can buy the property, and the property is technically ours to own. But we can buy it, but we can't really buy it, if that makes sense, because we can't do anything with it. That is, we can't farm. I remember calling the municipality. I was quite nervous because if we can't do anything with these parts of, not the whole property, but a large chunk of it, about 3-4 acres of it, if we can't do anything with it, then can we walk on it? Can we make paths on it? What happens if I'm plowing snow or something and do I get fined if I wreck a tree? In other words, for good, I would argue that those laws are good, and actually we don't have to pay taxes on that 3 or 4 acres. It's considered tax-free because we can't really use it for anything. And as long as we maintain it, that's a good thing because then they're happy. But then it's not really ours. So we pay for it, paid money for it, but it's not ours. We don't get to have a say. What about the rest of the property? Well, the rest of the property was also designated of some environmental values, forest here, forest there. And we were told that even though there were large parts of it that were just open space without any forest on it, we couldn't farm it. We could never go out there and cut out the brush and cut out the few trees that are in certain spots, and we can't plant a crop. That was weird. So consider now, I like to feed my family, I like to eat. We have the space, not in the city, but we have the space out at the property to farm and make our own food. but the government says no because it has other interests from the property. Other interests from the property that it will never manage, it will never work, it will never use. Not just the high environmental impact area, but the rest of it, really, I can't farm. It's weird to think about how the power of an anonymous government is everywhere. It's everywhere. So when we talk about individual freedom, it's troubling in the context of a government that has rules that apply to us all. In the bedroom, everywhere, in the dark, the rules are there, the laws are there, conditioning our behavior, conditioning how we think. And that's an odd way to live. This raises the basic contrast between the Western and the Indigenous community values, in which traditionally at least, and I'm not sure if this is true because I've never lived in an Indigenous community, but Alfred is saying that in the Western world, and I think we can agree with this, there's a great deal of reliance on the control to gain power. The control of food, control of wealth, control of transportation, control through laws, necessary often to simply structure society, but also very helpful for people who want power. Traditional Indigenous thought isn't opposed to the idea of power, but it rethinks power and thinks of it more maybe in terms of an empowerment, this idea that power over another person shouldn't be the dominant form of control. So if I come to you and I exert my will over your will and I get you to do something, that's power over you. But if we can find an agreement or come together as two human beings to encourage one another, to enact our own wills, to express ourselves, to live well together, that's an empowering. So we both mutually benefit from, again, that inspirational kind of leadership idea instead of a top-down hierarchy where my power is at the direct expense of your freedom and your will. Traditional Indigenous definitions see, quote, leadership rooted in a set of personal values consistent with and supportive of the collective's values, end quote. This is interesting. Leadership rooted in a set of personal values that are consistent with and supportive of the collective's values. Radical bipartisanship, in other words, would immediately be seen as a sign of unhealthiness. I mean, we get that, but for the bipartisanship and the conflict and the radical disparity between values, the constant conflict, for that to rise to the level where people in Western cultures go, oh, this seems to be an issue. That seems to be an overwhelming, there's an overwhelming problem before we recognize it. And in Indigenous communities, the argument here is that they're much more sensitive to that because the very idea of health or progress relies on, again, consensus building. It relies on that primacy of conscience. And so when people are in direct conflict with one another, and trying to have control over one another, then that would raise a lot more red flags than we often realize in the traditional Western cultures. Alfred sets up this basic contrast between peace and harmony in a culture and greed and consumer materialism, just consumerism. Quote, Indigenous forms of government promoting the realization of spiritual objectives and high values such as peace and harmony. What's power? Indigenous forms of government promoting the realization of spiritual objectives and high values such as peace and harmony. What is a good society? Something to do with the promotion of peace and harmony. What would lead to happiness? Something to do with the promotion of peace and harmony. And what screws it all up? Greed and consumer material culture, among other things. A misunderstanding of power relation as power over other people, among other things. I think we could probably agree with this. The more our culture proposes or exemplifies or pushes this stuff will make you happy thing, the more we realize it's quite empty. But peace and harmony, these are difficult concepts. Peace and harmony. Do we feel like our culture is at peace and that it has some sense of harmony? Well, the other things that we've talked about in terms of a centralized course of power that says you can have individual pursuit of happiness, individual freedom, but really doesn't let us have that. If at heart we're in constant conflict between neighbors we don't even know, jostling between the various forms of rights and responsibilities that we're not even fully cognizant of. No, there's no peace and harmony, or at least very little peace and harmony. And that should be the true test of an empowering, I should say empowering government, but empowering community. An empowering community should have this sense of peace and harmony. Do we even have that? Do we even have that goal anymore as a culture? Or are we so disillusioned and put off by the constant failures of politicians that that very notion is no longer even on the table? That's something to think about. Alfred points out that many in the Indigenous communities today suffer the same problems as the larger community. That is, that they don't have the wherewithal, they don't have the interest or the power or the strength to live these traditional values. And so, that is traditional values of non-coerciveness, being transparent, the consensus-based system. And so they often end up taking on the perspective of these colonizing powers, in which power is power over others. And they set up government systems, and they set up tiered systems, hierarchies in which people are in power over others. And they do this in part, obviously, so that they can communicate with the larger system that requires it. The system of the Canadian government requires legislative bodies to be in contact with other legislative bodies. The Government of Canada thinks a certain way. I expect you to come to the table as you're going to be an elected official. Although you're from an Indigenous community, you need to be an elected official, like I'm an elected official, and there are going to be laws governing your behavior like there are laws governing my behavior, and then we can come to the table and negotiate, because that's the kind of conversation it's expecting. But what if that whole system is messy? I know I use the word system a lot, but the whole paradigm or the whole way of thinking about it is steeped in this power over another. Again, not consensus building, often not consensus building, but coercive, which leads to all kinds of other issues of greed and corruption. And the sky's the limit. Your imagination can run wild on that. Quote, one of the methods of manipulation of the government is to inoculate individuals with the bourgeoisie appetite for personal success, end quote. This is interesting. To inoculate individuals with this general sense of personal success. So one of the ways that the larger power systems that want us to be obedient and to create our own power systems and to have the Indigenous community create their power systems to control their people in a hierarchy, one of the ways they do it is they convince people, you want to be wealthy, you want to be rich, you want to have some power, you want to have a little piece of paradise, and there we go. The idea of personal success as anathema or contradictory to the consensus community building. That is a huge idea, that the very idea of success, of personal success, is opposed to ultimate, or some greater sense at least, of harmony and peace. If I'm constantly thinking about my own sense of progress, and I envision that in terms of wealth and power, that is making my community unhealthy. It's making me unhealthy. There's something to that. To a large degree, I think I buy that. I can see many of the people, as you can too, who are in power, obsessed with money, and seem to care very little for minority groups, seem to care very little for those who are impoverished. Why? There's no connection there. The understanding of progress and success has been misunderstood. The lingering problem for Indigenous communities today, according to Alfred, the band councils, tribal councils, the Assembly of First Nations are all, quote, creatures of the federal government, end quote. It's insidious, in other words. The very idea of how you run a culture needs to be like this. What is it? Well, again, it's that centralized, coercive power type structure, which is opposed to traditional Indigenous values. They don't work together that way. This leads into a larger issue of the idea of sovereignty, something I'm really not qualified to talk about, but Alfred takes this up in the context of Indigenous communities today and argues that if they are fighting for sovereignty, and if that sovereignty is defined as having the same kind of power, and legislative power and control that they see of the government, and the government is kind of in a way giving it to them, the whole thing is screwy. The whole thing doesn't make sense. That's not the kind of sovereignty that we should be pursuing, to have Indigenous communities sort of mini versions of Canada with, again, the coercive centralized power structure. So if I'm understanding Alfred correctly, there are a number of things about traditional Indigenous communities for which I've never experienced, or of which I've never experienced, but I can agree with. The idea of consumerism not leading to a life of peace and happiness or harmony, yeah, that seems to be pretty obviously the case, although, it doesn't inherently mean we can't have a harmonious, peaceful existence with others, but it certainly leads in that direction. The idea, and that would lead into other problems of capitalism and unrestrained growth and the need for a 1% growth or it collapses. Capitalism is just, we need to grow or we're going to die idea, which is just weird. I can get on board with the idea of a centralized or coercive power paradigm as dangerous. It may be necessary given the sheer volume of how many people live in each country, but maybe we can do something to help mitigate, including stronger municipalities or stronger provincial governments to help gain some stronger consensual agreement between people. The exploitation of nature, extending rights, dignity, and respect to not just other people, but other things. That too I can get on board with, and I think many people are, more and more. Will we consider ourselves equals with possums and equals with squirrels? No, there's always that sense that we need to eat and we need to exploit our surroundings, but so do other animals. They need to eat and exploit their surroundings too. But still, we can extend some greater sense of equality beyond just the human species that would benefit us all. So what are we aiming for? Respect. Respect for all things as much as possible. A greater sense of harmony and peace within the community in which we expect to and even demand of ourselves conversation and dialogue that would lead to that sense of consensus, a decision-making process that truly involves everyone, as close to direct democracy instead of representative democracy as possible. Alfred gives the story of two gentlemen fighting over a horse, and one of them claims that the other one stole his horse. And this is a gentleman who has a horse, and the community leader gets involved, and obviously the dispute seems to be something, it's his word against somebody else's word. What do you do when two people are saying, hey, you owe me a horse, and the other guy says, no, I don't? The community leader sacrifices one of his own. He doesn't kill it, he gives it to the person without a horse. Consider that for a moment, that weird way of thinking where in our culture, a leader is one who distributes resources as they see fit. They don't take their own resources or assets and give them out. I don't know of any world leader, I don't know actually a lot of the world leader economics, I don't know of any Western world leader who's ever left office poorer than when they went in. They get, especially when they get the book deals and everything else, when they leave office, they leave more financially stable. So I'll leave you with this last idea, that the very concept of being an inspiring leader seeking harmony and peace is one of sacrifice. One in which you not only sacrifice your time, but your cult status, your popularity. These are not the things you're striving towards. The redistribution of tax dollars of other Canadians, that's important, but that's not what you're striving towards. You're striving to be a model of care and respect, even if that means giving one of your own horses. In this case, it would be, if I was in charge, giving my own money, doing something truly charitable and caring. So are there some things about traditional Indigenous values that might get us questioning some of our own? Absolutely. Are they entirely as practical and as efficient? Maybe not. Are they worth striving towards? Maybe so.